Okay, John, why don't we get going? We've got a pretty reasonable group on, and I think it's growing. But be good if you wouldn't mind. Let's get started.
Okay, thank you. This is a project we're doing in Portland, Oregon, and it's the first of its kind. It's essentially an investment product for people within 4 zip codes of this property that you see on the screen. That's half of the property. There's another half that mimics it with a downstairs. It's 29,000 square feet and houses roughly 26, 27 commercial retail tenants of a broad range of for-profit and nonprofit businesses that reflect the diversity and dynamics of that neighborhood. And what we've done is created essentially what people in the neighborhood had asked for. We had done some surveys, kind of a human-centered design approach, and we asked people if they were saving or investing. And a good percentage of this neighborhood, 65, 67% roughly, are renters. And this is a kind of a reflection of the circumstances that to drive us to create this investment product. So what it is essentially is a commercial retail property in outer Southeast Portland, and it's attempting to include people into investing where they otherwise are left on the margins or not included. And the key difference between this and anything else in the market is that it targets people on a monthly investment level, not a block of money. So people come in and they fit it into their budget. And we're training people in 5 languages in the neighborhood on a course of how to invest, how to budget, how to plan, and then connect them to this opportunity to invest on a monthly basis. The investment is protected from loss. People cannot lose their money, and they can get out at any point in time. And they get both a short-term return and a long-term return. So the short-term return is a dividend every year based on the performance of the property. And then their long-term return is based on the share price change from the value of the property and the pay down of debt.
And so the investment here is indexed to the property value, but it's not tied, because if it goes down, it doesn't. They don't lose. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, that's, in a sense, that's right. The way we did this, without getting into the complicated part of it, is we've got a conventional loan on the building, and we put it into a separate corporation. So Mercy Corps has no ownership interest whatsoever in it, but we had built the value over 3 years. We know it has strong cash flow and good tenants, and we got a direct pay letter of credit from the bank, so that stands in at any point in time to secure any potential loss for the investors.
And can this is it tied specifically to the land and the buildings, or can it be other community assets? I mean, could funds be used to to provide various forms of transit, or to fill out to allow a retailer to invest in building a business there? Is it in the community that you can make investments, or is it very specifically in this case?
It's specifically to the project.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, those other community attributes and other projects would be something that would be important and interesting to tie into it, but it's not for this model. It isn't built into it. So it could be part of a wider redevelopment effort that incorporated other aspects that were funded separately, but this one is really about giving people access to an investment, targeting in renters that don't get really the benefit of paying down debt and the default mechanism of a mortgage, and including them in the community in a deeper, tangible level. So this slide here shows kind of what we found out when we talked with people. Is that they were motivated to save and invest for things that are predictable to all of us: their kids' education, emergency, to purchase a home, retirement, and then a range of other things: to start a business, buy a car, get out of debt. And they asked for classes. I'd like to invest, but I haven't invested. real estate is kind of top of my list of what I'm interested in, partly because a lot of people want to buy a home, or they just see their neighborhoods changing around them, and they want to be part of something, whether it's gentrification or just some positive aspects of change in the community. So we focused on real estate and asked people what kind of businesses and enterprises are missing in the community, and what would you like to support. And we found this property was in foreclosure, and bought it, fixed it up, re-tenanted it, solidified the property, did some deferred maintenance, and there we had the investment product that we initiated just in last November. It'll be for roughly 300 to 500 investors over time, because again, they're coming in at monthly investment rates or investment amounts of $10, $25, $50, $75, or $100, and that's the maximum that they can invest. We modeled it initially after a REIT. A REIT has a 100 investor rule, so we need to get 100 investors, and we're shy of that by a good amount as we build this up and people take the course before they can invest. Whether we choose a REIT is going to be subject to really whether it's beneficial to the investors. It's a tax designation that doesn't tax the corporation, but the distributions are taxed. In our particular property case, it may not make financial sense to do it, but we'll adhere to some of the principles of the annual distribution and other structures of the REIT, and we may not do the designation or the tax election as a REIT, primarily because the compliance costs are high for this size of a property, and it may not be the same advantage to the investors because our tax on this particular property is not high enough to give it much of an advantage. So for those of you that
oatmeal here
that don't know Portland, this is a snapshot of what the geography of the neighborhood and where the investment is. So this is in outer southeast Portland, an area referred to as the Numbers, because the numbered streets that go out there. It's a lot like elsewhere in the country. We're targeting 4 zip codes. The properties you can see is right in between the 2 zip codes, and we wanted to include areas that had a lot of affordable housing, again, because we wanted to target renters. And the diversity of the neighborhood. It's the most diverse area in the state of Oregon. Nearby David Douglas School has, I think, 60 or 70 different languages spoken. So we really wanted to target people that just otherwise are kind of left on the margins of an opportunity such as this. This next slide here really just shows that a lot of people are being displaced elsewhere in the city from gentrification, and they're moving out towards this area where our property is. And the property is transboundary between Gresham and Rockwood and the city itself, Portland. So it isn't funded or supported in any way that restricted us from having it extend to the target of these zip codes, these 4 zip codes.
And John, the target of this, so the maximum investment here we're talking about is low, right? It's $100 or so. Is
Right.
Is that at a one time, or can people aggregate over a longer period of time, larger?
Oh no, that's the maximum that they do. But we have an online portal. They'll sign up. They'll do a automatic transfer ACH from their account every month. So they'll sign a subscription document when they initiate their investment at any point during the year, and that's taken out of their account at the level they choose for the full year. At the end of the calendar year, in December, January, they'll resubscribe. The share price will change, and they'll be able to adjust their investment amount up or down, but never over $100. Again, primarily because, entirely because we wanted to disperse the ownership widely into the community, with the idea that the benefits will extend both to the family itself, and then to the tenants in the building, that they'll have 300 to 500 families that own the property and will presumably get their hair cut there. Or there's a small owned taxi company, there's a funeral preparation, there's a tax preparers, health wellness providers, and a handful of nonprofits.
Do they get any other
test that
from being owners at that point? I mean, if I assume over a long period of time, it sounds like you can invest about $1,200 a year, and over 10 years, that's $12,000. It's not enormous, but it is some ownership in that development. Are there other benefits that they get? Is there visibility to them of the direct ownership? Is there sort of a loyalty card or a membership card? Is there anything that sort of ties them?
No, not yet. I think certainly any place that wants to replicate this could add dimensions to it that we just haven't for this one. What we found, initially when we surveyed people, and then what we're finding with the investors thus far, is just having a stake in the community that they otherwise had not had or didn't see a path towards is a large motivation. So we haven't induced their benefits outside of that, although we will hold community events at the building. So two things that we're doing. It'll be an extension of education and opportunity to come to the building. We'll do some community events there. What those will look like will, maybe a farmer's market or some sort of event to just have people celebrating the ownership. We're going to be doing, I hope, a event to disconnect the downspouts and depave part of the parking lot and put in some native plants, and people can come and be part of that. And then we want to just find out whether or not people patronize the business if they feel a sense of ownership that they may not have necessarily felt before. So in the context of economic development and traditional community economic development, we felt like the missing step was we were really good in Portland in particular, I think, of getting people together and having these visioning sessions, having people weigh in on what they want and what they would like to see in their neighborhood. But we don't put in the part for them to be part of the economic investing side of it. So you give input, but this one puts the investment into the equation. And it fulfills, we think, these economic development aspirations that you often hear: equitable development, inclusive financial growth, making gentrification work for you instead of against you. And it can be a catalyst for further development if that's one of the objectives that a city or neighborhood has.
So is there a transfer of ownership in the property that happens over time, or is it just an indexing? Is there, if somebody came to buy the property out from under them, after they've developed it over a couple 10, 15, 20 years, can they as owners have a voice in that, or does it get sold and they just benefit financially from the sale price? I mean, is there a linkage there?
Let me explain how the legal ownership that may help. So it's owned as a corporation. It's called East Portland Community CIT Corporation, Community Investment Trust Corporation. And that's overseen by a board of directors that is comprised of people from the neighborhood, from the community, experts, and people that have the fiduciary oversight for the building. Mercy Corps provides services, advisory services to that corporation to help guide them, particularly in the early days as we build the board. It only has 3 members thus far, of which 2 of us are members of Mercy Corps. But over time, we'll hand off the ownership or the oversight to those board members who may be investors or other leaders within the community. And it's their role to make the decision on the property itself, including, everything. We're really handing off the ownership and have handed it off entirely to the community. So the community owns the asset, and the investors will come in over time as they choose, take the course, and then sign up for the investment. But really, it's their choice of what future the building, what future the building has.
So
Did that?
it does, except a couple of orders of magnitude in dollar amounts. So in order to acquire the property in the first place, somebody had to invest,
Yeah.
millions of dollars, right? And the investments we're talking about here are, even if it's 1,000 people, you're only putting in 100,000 a month, so you wouldn't
Right.
you wouldn't get.
Let me explain that. Yeah, I think it might help if I explain how we purchased the property. So we bought it just three years and 4 months ago.
Mhm.
All right, and it was in foreclosure and it needed some work, and we purchased it with just for round off some numbers, 220,000 of Mercy Corps money that we put in as equity, along with an impact investor that put in 230. So with 450,000 in initial equity, we got a conventional bank loan to purchase the property, and then spent 3 years as we worked through some of the legal challenges of even creating this kind of an investment product, which was a tough hurdle. We had the time also to improve the property, stabilize the tenants, and build do the deferred maintenance. So today, the property is financed with a $920,000 long-term loan, 25-year amortization, 7-year term, and then the equity that we put in and the impact investor is being paid down. Their notes, and they're being paid down as investors come in. So it's just really transferring the equity ownership to the community investors.
Got it. Okay.
That 450,000.
Thank you. Now I get it. So they do really have. It is really a community asset at this point. You have the community, a series of small investor individuals throughout the community investing in and taking control of this property and then using it as a community asset.
Yeah, exactly that. Right.
Perfect.
And again, this is the first one in the country that has both a contained geography, the low dollar amount that fits into people's budget monthly, and then has the downside risk protection of the direct pay letter of credit with the bank. Now, this slide here is a better reflection of what the building is and was. So it was built on farmland. This area of town was largely farms until 1950s and 60s. So it was built on farmland in 1962, and it's 29,000 square feet. It's on 1.43 acres, so it's a big parcel, and then has 26, 27 tenants currently. A snapshot here I mentioned earlier, but a Latino and hair salon. There's 2 tax preparers that prepare taxes in multiple languages, East African nations, and then in Vietnamese and Chinese, and English. And then there's a low-cost funeral preparation or planning company that's been around the region for a long time. And then a Russian-owned importer of creams and lotions from former Soviet Union, Somali-owned taxi company, health wellness providers, and then a handful of nonprofits, including a transgender youth support group. And the Somali Association of Oregon just moved in and expanded their space. And then a group that works with the families of incarcerated individuals. So it's quite an interesting curation of tenants. Again, I think reflecting really strongly what the neighborhood wants and desires, and will support. All right. So when we talk to the community, it's important to simplify what otherwise seems sort of complicated behind the scenes, and it's really, there's your building, and when you buy shares, that money is going into the ownership of that building that you can see and go and patronize, and the business tenants pay their rent, and that pays the mortgage, and there's just kind of a chart and flow chart of where the money flows, and then you as an investor get the benefit of a dividend every year, and then the share price change, again based on the pay down of debt, as you would if you own a home, and on the increase in the property value over time. So these infographics, including this one, are our attempt to try to simplify or make something that otherwise seems a little hard to understand, understandable. So the kind of things that we'll be looking at, particularly as this project being an example of what we would like to see replicated around the country, and we'd like to license and coach organizations anywhere in the country about replicating the model is really 3 tracks. We want to find out, number one, does the property perform well, and does it meet the objectives of the investors? And will the investors stick to the investment? In other words, will they be an investor over a longer period of time and get the benefits of both the short and long-term return? And does it help them meet their own financial goals that they've outlined and talked about in the class that we offer, called Moving from Owing to Owning? And we do that in 5 languages. Do the tenants in the building do better when the neighborhood owns them? Does their business thrive, survive, do better? And do they become long-term tenants? Sort of the stability of the property will be the largest measure of that. And then, ultimately, we want to see how the community itself engages, and do people become more active if they own a piece of the neighborhood? Will they vote? So we're going to survey people annually if they voted through some baseline information and surveys. We want to test out, as the crime rates go down, the people volunteer when they get more engaged in the community. What's the community health like as a result of this sort of an investment? So again, going back to kind of our steps: learn, invest, and then profit. People will take this course, Moving from Owing to Owning, and that's a 2-session, 4-hour class, or we could do 4 sessions at 2 hours. And the way we do that is we stipend teachers in the neighborhood who people know, so the credibility is, and it's not externally dependent. So in other words, we're not teaching the course ourselves, but we stipend teachers at $25 an hour to teach these classes. The classes can be up to 12 people. It's a kind of a peer learning environment. And the classes are in English, Spanish, Russian, Vietnamese, and Arabic right now. We want to do another language. I think it'll probably be Somali, since that's a big presence both in the building and in the neighborhood. They take the course, then they have access to an online portal that they take a quick quiz, an 8-question quiz, as a confirmation that they understand some of the dimensions of budgeting, marketing, or budgeting and planning and investing. And then they choose their investment amount for the year, and they're in. Our aim is to get 150 investors by the end of this year, calendar year. And the business itself is, the property is profit making. We're just finalizing our audit now, and we're expecting to declare a 9% dividend for the handful of investors that we had at the end of the calendar year.
So you pay out a dividend as opposed to just accruing equity in the property?
Both. Okay. So they'll get an annual dividend just as you would in a private real estate investment trust. And then at the end of the year, we'll do an appraisal of the property. We'll calculate what the pay down of debt was, what the amortization is. That's an easy number to predict, obviously. And then what the appraised value is on an income approach, not the market approach. We're using income, so it's always tethered to the performance of the property, and therefore it's more predictable. So we won't see a price swing in share price. And it also helps protect the value protect the property from, let's just say, an aberrant, not necessarily aberrant, but it's on 1.43 acres. The property could have a market value that exceeds the operating profit of the building. So it's a more stable investment that'll provide, a more predictable share price change and not have a swing in value that would cause sort of a disruption of the investors. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm sort of eager at some point to dive into the details, and maybe that's not right here, but how do you protect from the downside? I mean, you may have covered a bit of this already, but can I, as a member of this, what are the rules under which I can cash out? If I leave the neighborhood, can I just make a request?
Yes. Yeah, somebody can suspend their investment anytime and just hold it. And then if you leave the neighborhood, the way we've got it, if you leave the neighborhood, you can keep your investment, but you can no longer add to it. We really want to maintain the community ownership.
Can you cash it out?
Yeah, and you can cash out. Anybody can cash out at any time they want.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
But then you have to put back in a slow way. You can't take it out and put it back in again. You have to, once you've cashed it out, you have to reinvest it.
You have to start over.
Yeah.
And you can imagine the management of essentially now $450,000 in equity isn't a large number, but having ultimately 300 to 500 investors take out that $450,000, it's not a lot of money for a lot of people. Most people, that's not a big investment, but it really does mean something to somebody that hasn't invested before.
Mm-hmm.
So we're considering it an on-ramp into investing and inclusion. And if people do well over 3 to 5 years and they start to meet their goals, they may pull their money out and move it into an alternative investment that they've learned about subsequent to getting involved in this. But this is just a good engaged starter, and it's kind of fitting the desires people had communicated to us that they would love to be involved in real estate, and they can only do it with a small amount of money that they have at the end of the month.
Do they? You talked about one of the things that seems really attractive with this is the issue of addressing gentrification. So, how does that work? If this property was now, some investor came along and said, "Look, I'm willing to spend $2.5 million to buy the property because I'm going to develop it in the following way." Would the board be allowed to accept that with the support of the members? And if so, would the members benefit from a 5x increase in their investment?
Yeah, that's exactly what could happen. Is the board of directors could act on their fiduciary oversight and meet the investors' desires, and they could cash it out, and the building could be scraped, and any number of alternative developments could happen there. In that case, that might be disappointing on one level because it didn't maintain some of the operating guidelines and the bylaws that we've established for the corporation ahead of time, which really try to drive some wider community benefits, such as B Corp principles, and to maintain the authenticity of these kinds of businesses. But gentrification is a force that's tough to entirely mitigate. I'd say in this case, where it benefits is the investors are going to be part of that gentrification process, so they're going to benefit as opposed to being pushed out or damaged. The businesses themselves, we would hope, would they can be investors as well if they live in the neighborhood. But again, it's going to be subject to operating principles and some bylaws, and having the board follow those bylaws. But there's always that risk that gentrification could push harder on the ideals of the initial bylaws and guiding principles.
No, I totally understand, and I agree with the alternative is actually more interesting, and I don't know how one would go about it, but we're really interested in how new facilities could be brought to these communities to help them. So, and that was where I sort of started with the vehicles, right? So in some cases, the problems that these communities might have would be a last mile transit problem. That there's there's a max stop that's, you know, a couple of miles away. And the value of the community could be greatly enhanced if there was good transit to the community and to the surrounding area. And how is there a mechanism by which investment in this property could be used? I mean, you're starting to go there a little bit when you were talking about removing part of the parking lot and having, you know, downspouts removed and maybe bioswales and other things that the improvement of the property is something that the community can promote, and that the board, on behalf of the community, would be allowed in some way to secure additional debt to be able to improve the property under the guidance of the board. I don't know if you've sort of thought through that kind of thing as part of this.
Well, I'd say probably not to the level you have, but you know, having looked at last mile kind of changes in potential transportation patterns, the Economist article from 2 or 3 weeks ago really kind of said, "Oh wow," to me, "Wow, this would be an opportunity to put from one of those transit hubs a development in early." That incorporated community investors just the way this does, that had whatever products and services of the property itself delivered, but then, you know, just the extended benefit of having that transportation hub or last mile autonomous vehicles or whatever happens at one of those stations that the community owned would, I think, drive more value into people's pockets as opposed to having it owned by either a government or a larger private sector entity. One thing that, in addition to the downspout disconnect, that would draw people in and inform them and educate them about the dimensions of some environmental improvements and storm water, wastewater disposal, is we're looking at photovoltaic or a solar system. And when we talk with the funders for that, and some of it's philanthropic funding, so it's easier to get, but I mean, it's easier to rationalize when we're acting as advisors for the corporation that owns the property now, is that when we do cost savings and enhancements such as that, it's compelling that investment, if it's subsidized, and there are subsidies to support PV systems, the benefit is driven directly to the bottom line, and that is distributed to the owners. So a lot of those kinds of enhancements to the property are much easier to make if there is a subsidy involved, or some form of an enhancement, because it's accomplishing the environmental and energy use goals, and at the same time it's driving those tangible cash benefits directly to community members at the same time. And presumably we've got the opportunity to educate people about what those investments entailed and how PV systems and wastewater systems work.
Thanks. That's getting much closer to what I think is really interesting to us, is how could this kind of mechanism be used to shift the focus from the value of the land to the value of the community, and build the equity around the community value. Because I think we struggle with this with some of the improvements that technology can bring. They improve the community, but they don't necessarily accrue value to the land, and so the investors in the land don't see as much value as the community would. And obvious things would be transportation options, mechanisms for dealing with energy waste and water, investing in public safety, Vision Zero and other things. And the community cares considerably more for them than the property owner. So if the value in the community is all represented in the land, then you don't see these improvements happening. Whereas if the value was seen as in the community, and the equity accrual was to the community in some way, then you would see those issues being addressed. And um, this is sort of pointing the way. It doesn't seem it's solving a slightly different problem, but a lot of the mechanisms might work very well in that space. So that was really the intriguing thing to me.
Yeah, it really democratizes the benefits potentially, and it gives people a more heightened probably. I mean, I would imagine. I mean, we'll be learning as we go with this, but a heightened sense of awareness of what those transitions and changes, whether they be transportation or or stormwater, energy use, et cetera. It puts them in a role to be both a beneficiary and an actor on wider public policy, voting, and decision making, and they've got a stronger stake and probably motivation to get involved and learn. Again, this is going to be one of the things that we really are anxious to test out and learn about.
How long has it been running now? I mean, are you starting to get data to help answer some of these questions, or is it?
It's too early. We launched the investment. Investors could make their first investment of November last year, so it's really in an early stage of that the investor engagement. I think we'll have a better sense when we do surveys at the end of the year in December when people resubscribe for another year. That'll be the point at which we can start to ask questions.
Thanks.
So this next step is really to help people think anywhere how they might start thinking about this. So we've had a number of organizations around the country in the, I'd call it tire kicker stage, where this sounds interesting, we'd like to get started. But really, from our own experience, it takes a kind of a team in a community to initiate this. And it takes a lead organization that has some connection to the community itself, or a range of community organizations, whether it be affordable housing, neighborhood association, churches. We work with all of those within this geography to kind of catalyze interest and make sure that we connect with the groups of diversity that we want to have included in this. Anybody can invest, but again, we're trying to drive the access down to people that otherwise feel like they're not included, and for all sorts of practical, functional, and financial reasons haven't been included. So, organizing the community itself, and then having an advisory board that can help you manage a property, make good financial decisions, have connections with funders, and have kind of the authenticity of the project finance side of it is imperative. And then we're standing behind this as an organization because what we've created has some proprietary protection, and it'd be nearly impossible for anybody to completely replicate this because we've been building it for a number of years. The online investment portal, the website itself that any project could plug into, and I should mention that the website that we're using is investcit.com, and if you look at that, you can get a sense of how we're communicating to investors. Mainly, that site is designed to communicate to people that would be interested in being an investor, and it has a good video that explains the project in a holistic sense. And then if people wanted to take action, in our case, you need to put in their zip code. 4 zip codes, then they're into the site to be able to make a step to take the class, then invest. But the community anywhere in the country could plug into, and that's our vision, is they can plug into that same site, put their own geography, if in fact they have a contained geography around the property. Doesn't have to be, but we want that for this particular pilot project, just to test out those synergies again of ownership and whether people patronize the businesses, and there's that mutually reinforcing benefit. And let me just tell you, this is one of our city commissioners, Nick Fish in Portland, on the left, and one of our early investors, Jermaine, on the right. And Jermaine has a great story, and he's been a great advocate for the project within his own community. And and his story was that he likes to share was that he was smoking a bit too much and hadn't really owned anything, and certainly not owned, was leasing his car, leasing his, renting his home. And his youngest daughter said, you know, he was explaining the project to her, and how he had come to the conclusion through the budgeting class that if he stopped smoking a certain amount, that would provide enough money to translate over into being an investor in this building. So his daughter refers to the building as, you know, Daddy, that's your no smoking building. And that's kind of what the class does, is guide people to think about what decisions they make could just carve out enough to be even a small monthly investor and initiate a transition into moving from owing to owning.
Very cool. Anybody got questions for John? Yeah, I'm really interested in how this could be used to sort of shift the thinking towards you know, investment in the community. I think we do have a struggle. You know, when I look at some of the downtown Portland projects and the interest in you know, in establishing affordable housing, and you know, we need a different way of thinking about investment than just you know, square footage and dollars per square foot. And you know, as you mentioned, the approach here is much more sort of a B Corp. That there, obviously, the equity and the investment is important, and you can't put it in a position where people in need are risking their investment. But if you could in some way shift the thinking away from land value and much more towards community value, then you know, you do start to address some of the biggest problems we have around gentrification, and you also potentially could direct investment into things that benefit the community, not just the land, like last mile transit and you know, public safety. I suspect that people living in areas that might get hit badly by the quake would be more likely to invest than you know, simple property investors.
Hey, Will.
Yeah.
This is Lisa Scooby, and I had a question, and also just to layer into what you're sharing, there are some new mechanisms with SEC now allowing for intrastate crowdfunding. Hatch Innovation is a model of that. I'd shared in the comment thread a really neat example of real estate investment, very much like what John and Mercy Court is doing. And John, that was a question for you, is Hatch Innovation and a lot of these groups across the country. I think there's 36 states now that are doing intrastate crowdfunding. The Oregon Kitchen Table is an example for folks on the call if they wanted to Google that are doing a lot of really interesting micro investment and investment from the community into things like land or parks, places that are special. I think one of the corridors had some investment from one of these activities at Oregon Kitchen Table. And John, when you guys were setting this up for the organization, had you looked at some of those types of models? Is this like that? Are you familiar with some of this?
Yeah, it's different. Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah, we are. This one is different because we've got the backstop protection for investors, and we're targeting low-income investors. So there's some similarities. We got an intrastate exemption initially to do this, but we wanted to do a protection for the investors, just given we thought it was appropriate to not put low-income investors at risk into a project. And the other crowdfunding models, which are all great to democratize access, but they don't protect investors from a downside. This one does. That's the key difference, really.
Do you think that there's going to be more of that? Because the idea of the intrastate, like the local boards for the slow food movement, they're calling it like the slow investment movement, to really try to localize a lot of the investments that we're seeing from Main Street. back to more of a, Wall Street to Main Street. Excuse me. So do you see that this would be more adopted into those types of programs? Because it seems really essential in helping communities feel that they have more empowerment in policy and decisions and how they're purchasing dollars or
yeah, no, this one is exactly designed for that because again, it's got we're looking at 4 zip codes exclusively, and most of the crowdfunding it may have the intention of localizing, and it certainly does, I think in your case, from what I understand. But this one, you cannot invest unless you're in the 4 approximate zip codes to the property.
Have you guys leveraged Nextdoor, the community community site that is also very much specific indigenous to the local zip codes? Do you guys use that as a communication? And that would be a great question probably for the group as well. What communication vehicles that you use for the groups to be educated and informed, to be aware that the opportunity is available? I think that for the GCTC community, that's a really big piece of what folks are thinking about. How do you localize the way that things are both invested in, but how everybody knows about that, how everybody participates and weighs in?
Yeah, I don't know Nextdoor. I can look it up. If it's the way we've done it in this community is through community organizations. There's East Portland Action Plan, a lot of members there. So between schools, churches, affordable housing, and then agencies that are working in that neighborhood. So it's largely through them and networks that are, I'd call them more like stealth, particularly when we're dealing with Russian, Somali. It's a lot of their community organizations that aren't as well known, and may not be connected to more conventional mechanisms that you and I may think are easier to get online and do it, but they're really through community meetings and other sources. So we're working through them primarily, and word of mouth between investors to connect.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Any other questions?
All right.
It's a great story, John. I much appreciate it, and good food for thought on how to deal with this sort of shift to thinking about community first. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Cheers.